Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to wish you and every member the very best as we return to this House in this new year. Just as it affords us a chance to leave behind old habits that do us harm, a new year allows us to reevaluate and correct our course. If there's one message my constituents would relay to the government as we enter 2021, it's that it should resolve to get back to normal. Economic indicators across the country are not encouraging, and as the outlook worsens, the impact of this government's pattern of neglect and regional division will only amplify in Western Canada. The consensus that I received from my constituents over the past many months is clear. They don't want a global pandemic to be the pretext for a great reset of our economy, nor do they want this government's continued failure to effectively fight COVID-19 to justify inaction on our economic recovery. My constituents demand a common-sense approach to recovery. They want to get back to work. They want a government that creates the conditions for every sector of our economy to thrive, but otherwise stay out of their lives. They recognize that stable work and reliable paychecks will be the key to emerging from this pandemic as quickly as possible. Speaker, Conservatives were proud to stand up for Canadians when the pandemic hit. We worked to improve and accelerate many of the government's relief programs. They were needed and have done a lot of good. Indeed, Conservatives pushed for Parliament to reconvene as often as possible for the sake of navigating our country through the storm. Unfortunately, our calls were largely ignored. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not March or April anymore. In January 2021, we have a much better understanding of this virus and how to mitigate its effects. It's time to begin our road to normalcy and recovery. Why? It's clear that the current approach to spending cannot continue on indefinitely. Let's reiterate the seriousness of some vital economic indicators that this government has helped to exacerbate. Looking at debt, Canadians are being asked to shoulder the burden of $8.6 trillion of household, corporate and government debt. This equates to 387% of our GDP. Over the last 6 years, there's been a 40% increase in our debt, outpacing our growth in GDP by 3 times. Government debt itself, in particular, has grown larger than Canada's GDP, and that was this government's measuring stick. Our situation is worse than that faced by Greece during the sovereign debt crisis or the United States during the 2008 financial crisis. Never before has our country faced such a burden of debt with no plan to address it. Our deficit is higher than at any point in our history, now at 17% of our GDP. Not even the deficits amassed during World War I, at the height of the Great Depression, or the 2007-2009 recession come close to our current deficit as a percentage of GDP. What's more, the government continues to lack a plan to return to some level of balance. And what do we have to show for this spending? Very little. Our unemployment remains the highest in the G7, despite spending the most among OECD countries. Speaker, we could have been facing an entirely different situation had the government buckled down when times were good. From day one, it was clear that the Liberals had no interest in honouring their spending promises. Over the course of their first mandate, they spent the cupboard bare, adding $100 billion of debt before COVID even reached our shores. These patterns of reckless spending and anti-enterprise overreach have real consequences. Before the pandemic even began, $160 billion in investment left Canada because of this government's poor decisions, leaving us in a weakened position. So what could make the situation worse? Well, for one, this bill proposes to make COVID-era spending permanent. It asks for a $700 billion increase in the borrowing limit, reaching $1.8 trillion by 2024. Speaker, it's almost as if the Liberals have no long-term plan to engage the hard work and ingenuity of the Canadian worker. Let's let Canadians do their part to carry us through the storm. Rather than picking favourites, the Liberals should tap into the talents of every worker to produce the goods and services that the world will buy. The government must level the competitiveness playing field with the rest of the world. Just as Canadians must be empowered to lead us into a robust economic recovery, the government's responsibility lies with their public health response to the pandemic. In my view, they have clearly failed. Last night, I had the pleasure of listening to my colleague from Cloverdale, Langley City, speak to the detailed systems that have been in place for years in the greenhouse industry to prevent and shut down viruses before they can severely damage the health of their plants and the productivity of their businesses. She then compared it to the fallacies of this Liberal government's response to the coronavirus outbreak. Canadians simply want, a truthful answer from this government. First of all, why did the Liberals make such obvious errors in responding to this pandemic from the very beginning? Allowing 60,000 people into Canada from China in the first 3 months and never closing our borders. Ignoring the first-hand warnings that came from our Department of National Defence that a crisis was coming. Giving away precious stock of PPE to China and taking too long to secure what our first responders needed, as well as the general public. Saying wearing a mask is immaterial, and then insisting it was mandatory, even when social distancing indoors and outdoors. Shutting down small businesses, but not huge international box stores. Not ensuring balanced reporting as their media outlets continue to focus 24/7 on only the dangers of COVID, instilling fear of the disease and fear of repercussions on children, parents, employees, employers, small business owners, seniors, students, and saying staying safe is really only possible through isolation. Anything else, you're taking a big risk. Failing to provide rapid tests that would enable people to return to work faster and keep businesses open. Focusing only on a vaccine agreement with China to begin with, which didn't materialize, not surprising. Effectively putting us in the precarious position that we are now facing for those who wish to be vaccinated but are left waiting. All of these missteps are having huge repercussions on Canada's economy, and they are not the only factors stonewalling our ability to do what we are capable of doing as a nation, to be the first country in the world to restore our economy and to restore the ability of Canadians to get back to work, get back to school, sports, special occasions, and being with their families and friends. The very people that we are sent here to represent have more questions that leave them anxious and confused by their government's actions and by their doublespeak. Why are they continuing to raise the carbon tax during the pandemic? Why are the Liberals pushing the clean fuel standard and introducing a bill that requires Canada to reach zero emissions in 50 years from now when they can't meet the commitments that they've already set? Why would the Prime Minister want to cause such increased devastation to the livelihood of the middle class and the working poor who are struggling more than ever now to join it? Why do they ignore the amazing contributions of rural Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, Western Canadians, and East Coast Canadians who have generated the wealth of this nation and to date, and who have received no credit, no recognition, and no appreciation for the internationally recognized environmental achievements of our agriculture, resource, and manufacturing industries across Canada, without which the source of wealth for those who live in our beautiful major cities would not exist? Why do they want to stagnate and kill Canada's oil and gas industry? And for that matter, the cutting-edge carbon sequestering clean coal industry, when the best resources and highest standards for environmental protections in the world exist right here and should be championed and shared all over the world. Jerry Dias, while participating in a corporate Knights Round Table, spoke to the need for Canada to move forward with building and purchasing electric cars and installing charging stations across the country, which is a good thing. My brother loves his out on the West Coast. But truly, if the Liberal government cared about Canadians and this nation, they would hear what Jerry said. 40 more years of oil will be needed around the world. They should be using every opportunity to grow our economy and be truthful and transparent and a servant-oriented government. They could be honest about why their response to the coronavirus has been so ineffective. C-14 would give this government unprecedented access to billions more of Canadian tax dollars with no accountability to its citizens. At this time, when those tax dollars literally do not and will not exist for years to come because of their poor financial management, This government is printing money so that it is in control of our democracy instead of the Canadian people, and controlling the economy rather than enabling free enterprise. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Cathay Wagantall, the honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And quite apart from the Prime Minister's stated intention to phase out the oil sands and how he stands to benefit electorally should the West leave Canada, the immediate crisis, as my colleague mentioned, is the absence of vaccines available for inoculation in Canada. So today there's none. 9 days ago, Canada was 10th in line for vaccines. Europe, the EU, is putting a Europe first approach into place for the vaccines. Canada's falling further and further behind. What are the members' constituents who have been designated as non-essential telling her about the state we now find ourselves in and going by the wayside with absolutely no income?
Member for Yorkton Melville.
I thank my colleague for her question. My constituents are very frustrated. They're very frustrated with the approach that this government has taken to this entire pandemic. We are a very resourceful and creative group of people who want to see our economy thrive, even in the midst of this pandemic. Yes, there is definite concern about every step that this government has taken in regards to dealing with this virus, and I outlined a lot of them in my speech, and I'm speaking on their behalf. When it comes to the vaccines themselves, there is definitely a need for those vaccines to be available in Canada in a far more significant way than they are now, and clearly this government dropped the ball on that provision. However, I'm also pleased to say that in my riding that I represent, those vaccines are needed and wanted, but under the conditions that it is voluntary to have those vaccines and to serve.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I listen to the member, I hear a bit of what one would classify as hypocrisy. On the one hand, the Conservatives try to give the impression that the government is borrowing too much money. Yet, on the other hand, they tend to support the initiatives that we are taking in order to support Canadians and small businesses. For example, many of those billions of dollars going towards the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program, the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy Program, the Emergency Business Account, regional relief and recovery funds. Yet we get more Conservative MPs saying, in some senses, that we're not doing enough yet. We should still be spending more on small businesses. And then they want to criticize in terms of borrowing money. Can the member clearly indicate to Canadians where does she want to see the cuts to some of the programs that we have brought forward, or does she support the entirety?
The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The hypocrisy is on the other side of the floor. On this side, it's what's called good governance. Yes, we needed that support for Canadians. There's no question. My constituents agree with that. However, they're also saying in the midst of this, what's happening is this government is preferring to put our existing economy to sleep. And we have people in my riding who are getting the wonderful Canadian Child Benefit and appreciate it. We brought it in. However, what they're saying to me is that was supposed to be in addition to our income. And now we're in a position where we are depending on that, and it's not enough. We need to get back to work.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for her speech. I sat on Veterans Affairs Committee with her, and I genuinely miss working with her on that committee. Mr. Speaker, we're 9 years out to meet our Paris climate commitment, and the government has done very little to support farmers and encourage them to lower emissions and to move towards alternative energy or improve nitrogen management and whatnot. I wrote a letter in support of Farmers for Climate Solutions, Subin, calling for supports for farmers. And the government came out with $90 million. They're needing $300 million. Largely, farmers haven't been engaged and encouraged to get involved and do their part as they already are doing, but to really modernize their practices and get the support they need. Can maybe my colleagues speak about how important it is for the government to support the Farmers for Climate Solutions and all farmers, and ensuring that they're able to participate even more than they do now in lowering emissions? And
The Honourable, we're out of time, the Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
That's unfortunate, because my farmers tend to get the out of time a lot. There is significant things that our farmers do in my riding in Saskatchewan that have been making a difference to the environment in unbelievable levels, to the point where at the APES summit in 2017, the researchers at our University of Saskatchewan hospital said that if we continue on with what we are doing to improve the way that we farm, we will offset all of the emissions from the oil sands within the next decade. I'm very proud of what we're doing, and our farmers need real help when they needed it, and they didn't get it from this government.